Declension of hehora. First declension feminine, pure alpha, rho or vowel. Hora, horas, hora, horon, hora. Horai, horon, horais, horas, horai. What's the declension of he phone? First declension feminine, pure eta, phone, phones, phone, phonane, phone. Phonai, phonon, phonice, phonus, phonai. What's the declension of he doxa? First declension feminine, mixed. Doxa, doxase, doxe, doxon, doxa. Doxai, doxone, doxice, doxus, doxai. What's the declension of ha prophetes? First declension masculine, prophetes, prophetu, prophete, prophetane, propheta. Propheti, prophetone, prophetis, prophetus, propheti. What's the declension of ha logos? Second declension masculine, logos, logu, logo, logon, logat. Logoi, logos, logois, logus, logoi. What's the declension of ta ergon? Second declension neuter, ergon, ergu, ergo, ergon, ergon. Erga, ergon, ergois, erga, erga. What's the declension of ha archon, archontos? Third declension masculine feminine, archon, archontos, archonti, archonta, archon. Archontes, archonton, arcusi, archontus, archontes. Good job with archonton. Good job. That final, remember that ultima is long, so it drags that accent one closer. It can't give it the long rope, the 3-syllable rope. Good. What's the declension of ta soma, somatos? Third declension neuter, soma, somatos, somati, soma, soma. Somata, somatone, somacy, somata, somata. What's the declension of ha, he, ta? Ha, tu, to, ton, hoi, tone, tois, tus. He, taste, te, tain, high, tone, tice, tus. Ta, tu, to, ta, tone, tois, ta. What's the declension of ego, su? First and second person pronouns. Ego, emu, amoy, eme, hemes, hemon, hemin, hemus. Su, soy, se, hemes, humon, humin, humus. What are the principal parts of luo? Luo, luso, elusa, leluca, lelumai, aluthe. In the present, what's the conjugation of luo in the present active indicative? Luo, lues, lue, luamen, luete, luusi, infinitive, luane. What is the conjugation of luo? By the way, this is our new memory work for this chapter. What's the conjugation of luo in the present middle passive indicative? Luamai, lue, luetai, luametha, luestha, luantai. Infinitive, luesthai. What's the conjugation of ami in the present indicative? Ami, esti, esmen, este, ac. What's the conjugation of luo in the imperfect active indicative? Eluan, elues, elue, eluamen, eluete, eluan. What's the conjugation of luo in the imperfect middle passive indicative? Eluame, eluata, eluametha, eluistha, eluanta. What's the conjugation of ami in the imperfect indicative? Amen, ace, ain, amen, ate, ason. What's the conjugation of luo in the future active indicative? Luso, luces, luce, lusamen, lucete, lususi. Infinitive, lucane. What's the conjugation of luo in the future middle indicative? Lusamai, luce, lucitai, lusamatha, lucistha, lusamtai. Infinitive, lucistai. What's the conjugation of ami in the future indicative? Esamai, esse, estai, esamatha, eseste, esontai. What's the conjugation of lu in the first aorist active indicative? Elusa, elusas, eluse. Elusamen, elusate, elusun. Infinitive, lusai. All right. Last sheet. What's the conjugation of lu in the first aorist middle indicative? Elusamain, eluso, elusata, elusamatha, elusistha, elusanta. Infinitive, lususthai. What's the conjugation of lumbuno in the second aorist active indicative? Elabon, elabes, elabeth, elabamin, elabete, elabon. Infinitive, labane. What's the conjugation of lumbuno in the second aorist middle indicative? Elabame, elabu, elabata, elabamatha, elabestha, elabanta. Infinitive, labesthai. What's the conjugation of luo in the perfect active indicative? Leluca, lelucas, leluke, lelucamen, lelukate, lelukasi. Infinitive, lelucanai. Good job. What's the conjugation of luo in the perfect middle passive indicative? Lelumai, sai, lelutai, lelumitha, leluste, lelunta. Infinitive, lelustai. What's the conjugation of luo in the pluperfect active indicative? Elelucain, elelukes, eleluke, elelukemen, elelukete, elelukesun. What's the conjugation of luo in the aorist passive indicative? Eluthane, eluthes, eluth, eluthemen, eluthete, eluthesun. Infinitive, luthani. What's the conjugation of luo in the future passive indicative? Luthesamai, luthese, luthesatai, luthesamatha, luthesiste, luthesanta. Let's pray briefly. Yesu huye David, eleisonme hamartalan. Lovely. Take a seat. All right. I said our new stuff, we're going to be working on verbal voice, but before we get to the new stuff for chapter 9, or pardon me, lesson 9, let's go back to lesson 8 and see if there are any particular questions. I think I said this last time, but just to reiterate that, a couple things. One that I would highlight. One reason why, I had a student ask me, well, why aren't these third person and demonstrative forms, why aren't they on the recitation? That was a really good question. One is because time is limited, and so you have to discern, right, what do we put on it? And actually it would have put it over 4 pages, and so 4 pages front and back, just the right amount. But the answer really, let's see if you could kind of discern it. Why do you think I wouldn't necessarily include these, but I would include something like a go, a move, a moi, me. How are these forms here, like hutas, haute, tuta, becoming tutu, tautes, tutu? How would I put that on? That's exactly right. So that was exactly my reasoning. So it's not to say that you couldn't put it on, right, or it'd be foolish to put it on or anything like that, but it's like all things, so you have, for example, the adjective, very common adjective, alas, ale, alan. Notice it's not on. And on the one hand, again, that's unique, or that's different. It belongs with this kind of a demonstrative or other special adjective pattern. It's not normal to go as, and yet it is normal for these kinds of demonstrative and special adjectives to fit that pattern. And so, again, that's really it. So once you, again, look at the declensions, you kind of realize, oh, like a kanos becomes os, u, o, on, oi, on, ois, us. Same thing with the feminine. It's like a pure eta, a kane, a kanes, a kane, a kane. So anyway, so you kind of realize, like, yeah, there are a couple little tricks. Hutas becoming tutu, haute becoming tautes. So there are some of those, but on the whole, you're exactly right. It kind of looks like every other first and second declension that we've seen. The other thing I'll just highlight from this that I think is really important, it's kind of worth this may be like sacrilegious to some of you, but like dog-earing, page 44, till you get those positions down. So what's in an attributive position, for example, or a predicate position. The uses of autos versus like hutos or something like that. So that little bit right there on 44, I think it's kind of worth. Good, yeah. I mean, it's worth probably painting yourself just a smidge. Or if you're really fancy, you could have those little like mini Post-its or whatever. That was, even in grad school, I was always jealous of girls who like had all that stuff. You know, they had all the fancy things, and I had coffee that soaked my entire book all the way through. So, yeah, different. This is my second copy of this text. It's also been updated. All right. With that said, questions on the actual assignments, the translations themselves. I think I sent out the answer key last week. So. In theory. That's not to bust on you if you do have questions. Okay. Sure. Yeah. Oh, yeah? Yep. Ooh. Oh, I see. I have a typo. I think so. Ook, and... Sorry. Ook. Yeah, there. I was going to do it again. Right. Yeah, so that's right. Did I put a C on there? I did put a C, that's right. So it should be a key. If it's before, is it before a rough breather? Okay. Oh, Curiska. Oh, one thing I'll highlight. We do not find Curiska, man. One thing I'll highlight just because, actually, this is funny. So sometimes I make my epsilons like that. Sometimes I make my epsilons like that. Just deal with me. I don't know. Poor students. Anyway, just worth highlighting. I saw this with one of my high schoolers the other day. Rough breathers and accents will always go over the second letter of a diphthong at the start of the word. It would be the same thing if it was in the middle of a word. For example, well, it's not there. But anyway, if we had, like, let's just say it was whatever. It wouldn't be accented here, so just forgive me for this, but it would go, there's your diphthong, right? Ooh, and it would go on the second letter. So, no, that's not where it would go. Oh, that erases horribly. That's going to go really well for me. Let's grab another marker and see what happens. So that was a typo. What number was it? Number 4? Oh, 4 of English to Greek. Okay. Let me make myself a little note for correction. Anything else? Thank you for catching that. Oh. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Whatever. Is it just the confusion with like outcost, which is like one of the
Yes. Yes.
So
Yeah.
it's like confusing, like what really confusing?
Right. Right. Yeah. So specifically, right, that intensive, the bread itself, versus the identical, the same bread, versus the possessive, for example, if you had a genitive use right there. That's really where it gets confusing.
Okay.
Whereas like the demonstrative, your demonstratives, you're totally fine. Really.
Well, I think this is demonstrative when I was going back. I was understanding, but there didn't seem to be a ton of time
Mm-hmm.
stop for this happening outside.
Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and the only thing I would note as we get kind of more into like what I call big boy and big girl Greek, i.e. like real stuff. Now here, they kind of, one of the blessings of the book is like they kind of start throwing you right into actual sentences from the very beginning. So since you'll see that, we have to be aware of something we have already talked about before, is that these adjectives, and today we're not going to talk a ton about adjectives, but it's worth kind of remembering it here right up front. So adjectives can function, I dare someone have to go back to this one. Anyway, adjectives can function 3 ways. Do you remember kind of the 3 jobs an adjective can do? Okay, which is what? Good. Isn't that so dumb? It's so dumb, but that's the kind of thing you remember, right? So it's an adjective that acts like an adjective and a noun, right? Like, yes, it's substantial. Good, it puts on its substance. Okay, so this is where this could come up. So the others, just for review's sake, would be good, predicate, right? I am, he, whatever, and attributive. Good. Okay, so I want to focus in, the brown cow or whatever. Okay, so I want to focus in on this. Substantive. Okay, so a substantive adjective, if you have to really be on the lookout for what case it's in. Because a Greek writer at any point could drop an adjective into whatever case he wants, and that would do the noun and adjective duty. Right? So for example, if I said something like, the child, I'm not going to write the whole sentence, but like the child of that man. Right? And in Greek, I just could put like ta teknon, ekenu. Ekenu. The child of that man. So all I had to do was, that's right. So here's what our eyes would need to see. This sure does look like, nominative or an accusative. Could be also vocative. But anyway, this is not in the same case as this. Let me make my upsilon even more clearly in upsilon. Okay, so these are not in the same case. And I just have to have eyes that see, hold on, this does not have an option of functioning attributively, that child. Does that make sense? So that's where I would say, again, position can help you. But yeah, you can kind of get away with it as long as you're not writing from English into Greek with just being able to spot this case is not the same as this case. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's the thing I would say to kind of be on the lookout for is just like with that possessive genitive, his bread, right? I have to be aware that it's like, oh, it's autou of him, not autos ha artos, the very bread, the same, this bread. This bread itself. I never translate it that way. But anyway, let's just say that's how you're interested. Okay? So that's what I would say is it's worth, again, even if the position's kind of wonky, in most sentences you're going to be able to tell, like, oh, okay, these are both neuter nominative forms. They're going together. Like, they are. So if that's a little easier way to check it, totally fine. And you will find yourself as a translator often just feeling like, oh, this is like that bread. Like that's, even if you're not like, predicate position means this is here and that. Yeah, that's it. That count? Okay, that's fine-ish. We'll make do. What else? Anything else from the homework? Uh-huh. That's a really good question. That doesn't mean you're wrong, by the way. That doesn't mean you're wrong. Okay. So first, what part of speech is death? It's a conjunction. Okay. And what do conjunctions do? Good. And two things is so generic. Could you tell me more about the two things they conjoin? Okay. What's a thought?
Well, I mean, they can join either noun, they can join
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, hold on. Do they have a lot of different functions? Can they? Like, could I say, like, Mary and bowling?
No,
That's what a conjunction does. It joins two of the same thing. That's exactly right. So it could be two nouns.
like
it-
Mary and
There we go.
and then there's bowling and
There we go. So we could join up nouns, subject nouns. But notice we could not join a subject and a direct object. For example, if we said something like, John and him punched. No, it doesn't work because you want a John punched him. You can't just conjoin it because it's not the same kind of thing. Does that kind of make sense? So you could join all kinds of things, really anything. Objects of prepositions. I went to the school. Well, that's true as well. Right, yeah. And for us, we don't even... Yeah, right. Yeah, because we could do thoughts, right? That's right. That's right. Yes, yes. That's right. That's right. So, good. So we could add everything from, again, the smallest little adjective, like, I'm trying to think of really small adjectives, like big. That's what I want to say, a small adjective. How about big and tall? There we go. Too short, like 7 letters total, right? Big and tall, John, walk down the street or whatever. Okay? Or we could do clauses or phrases. Phrases like, I went to the school and away from my house. Those would be 2 clauses, or probably phrases. Or we do full clauses, right? Like, I was walking down the street and Susie came with me. Right? Those would be 2 full clauses. So conjunctions, the essence of a conjunction is that it joins 2 or more. Polly send a 10 and A send a 10 for tonight. Anyway, we're just going to say, simply put, it joins 2 of the same thing. That'll work for us. You can get more complicated with a chain of conjunctions, which sounds awkward to us, like Johnny and Susie and Billy. That's actually okay. That's called polysyndeton. Repeated conjunction used for fact. Anyway, so you could have more than 2. For our case, you would have. That's right. Usually we would replace that with comma. Right. So that sounds wrong to us, and it is wrong if you're teaching a 3rd grader how to write. It's not wrong if Winston Churchill says it. That'd be the difference between a 3rd grader and Winston Churchill. No other differences between a 3rd grader and Winston Churchill. That's right. That's right. That's right. Emphasis. I appreciate that. The emphasis. That is an old joke of, was it? I always put the emphasis on the incorrect syllable. Anyway, all right, so conjunction joins 2 things. This is a long interview. Okay. But then, even in like the conjunction world, I'm going to simplify it. I'm going to just put it on an x-axis. Maybe I could put an x and y-axis. I don't know, but just for simplicity's sake. We have what we could call a disjunctive conjunction, and we have what we could call a conjunctive conjunction. Or, right, that's right. So, our conjunction, for example, Kai, where would that go? Plus, right? So, Kai would be hanging out all the way down here. How about Allah? It's all the way down here. Yeah, but how about de? That's kind of the question, right? Okay, so let's just say maybe de is kind of hanging out right here in the middle. Do that to me. Okay, so here's my question then, and this is kind of your question, but now that we've kind of seen, oh wait, well, you could have a conjunction that separates, and you could have a conjunction that joins, so to speak. Which again, we could kind of go and refine this definition if we wanted to do something a little bit. But I'll just say this. How do we know if they're contrasting? For example, I like Susie, but not Timmy. Or they're putting them together. I like Susie and Timmy. And then you have something like de, right? Which in theory could go either way. So how would I know? Well, the first is, we have to know something about de. Is that it's special in that it only joins clauses. It only joins clauses. So that is to say, right, we've got to have clause 1 and clause 2. How do I write clause 1? Fair enough. It's joining it to the previous clause, which we don't like that. That's right. Like, that's what we teach kids from the early. I mean, go read the Bible. Every sentence starts with an and. Seriously. Like, every one starts with some kind of conjunction. And of course, we're like, that's bad. Okay. Anyway. Right,
Why
right,
it says
right.
therefore.
That's right. So in Greek, this clause may have a hard stop at the end of it. But this one still might have this de after whatever the first word is, right? Because it's post-positive. So whatever that, joining is, how would I know if it's a but de, simply put, or an and de? You do. You have to read the clauses before. So kind of what we're looking for then in the clauses are, do we have contrasting ideas? For example, Johnny went to the store, Billy did not. Now, it's not wrong if you said Johnny went to the store and Billy did not. That's not wrong, right? But when we hear or when we feel conflict or contrast, we're justified in saying that's probably a but. But Billy did not. Because de, how it is used. Trying to form up percentages in my mind. De is used almost always. I hope no real Greek people ever watch this. Anyway, the way it's used, and I'm thinking just New Testament. You crack open the New Testament, it is used in a sequential kind of a thing. It is this and that, or this but not that. It is just a chain, and so it's really about the relationship between these parts of the chain, not though it could in theory this could be one mega clause. You could have like 7 clauses here, but it's still one idea. Does that make sense? Is that kind of what you're asking? Okay, yeah. So you could have, and I have to go look. Like Paul would be a good place to look for this because he'll build up, like in Romans, for example, he'll spend, many sentences building up one idea. John does some similar things. And my hunch is what I'm rightly or wrongly thinking in my brain is he'll then just use it to either, a lot of times he'll actually use Verb. It's hard because he's doing a lot of logical inference. It's not. It can be what's called an exegetical gar. Like, let me dig into that a little bit more. Again, that's not where we are. But actually, it is kind of where we are. You're just asking the same question. You're saying, what is the relationship to these clauses? So, for example, with gar, for, well, what kind of clause logically would have a for in it? Yeah, it could be a therefore. Absolutely. So what kind of clause? Well, it could be actually with a therefore. What kind of clause follows a therefore? I love you, therefore let's get married. What's that clause? What would we call that? We can use a number of synonyms. I caught you with a knife in your hand, therefore you were the murderer. Okay, and what part of the logical sequence? It's a conclusion. That's exactly right. So therefore would be used for a conclusion. Versus, I'm actually not trying to complicate things. This is all your fault. Versus, watch, ready? The famous John 3:16. For God so loved the world, he sent his son. Think about that relationship. That is a premise, good, or a grounds clause. Why did God send his son? Well, because, so we would translate that one with a because, or a causal clause, or a grounds clause, or a premise. That'd be fine. And that leads to the conclusion. So you could say, because God so loved the world, therefore he sent his son. And you could totally do that, right? And so, all that to say is, whether it's de or whether it's ger, what we're doing is we're saying, what is the relationship between, again, these clauses, or it could be, again, a bigger idea. And you're going to have to decide which of the options it is. Because sometimes, you want to think like, golly, there's just no way that's a ground. Like, there's no way that clause is a ground for this previous, clause. And sure enough, it's not. And so learning kind of what we learn as we read more and more is we realize just kind of what our options are. What are our options? Because if all I think is gar equals grounds or premise clause, I'm going to read in, Romans 8, where he doubles down on his conclusion. He says, the fleshly man, the one who lives kata sarka, is not able to please God. For he does not. Now this one kind of makes sense. For he does not subject himself to God's law. Indeed, he cannot. And that is a gar clause. So why can't he please God? Oh, that's a ground. Because he cannot please God. But I think 2 clauses earlier, Paul uses gar exegetically to dig further into the point he just made in the previous clause. Paul. We're not in Paul yet. Keep Paul and Hebrews for later. Stick with Mark and John. Okay. Other questions? Yeah, just the nature of what you're reading is different, right? Reading a narrative is different from reading a 16-chapter logical argument. Preaching a 16-chapter logical argument is different from preaching a 16-chapter narrative, which is what Mark's gospel. It feels different. You feel more tired after. Alicia, you got one?
Yeah.
Okay. Sure. Mm-hmm. It is optional. Yep. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And there, as a reader, we always want to be soft. And I can't remember earlier where he's talking about pronouns. Pronouns almost always, when they're included, first you have to discern, is this needed? Right, so like, for example, if it's a second person plural verb, you never need humes in there. Never. I can always see that second person plural verb subject, in the verb itself. Does that make sense so far? So almost always, unless you're reading poetry, where it might have to do with the meter, the actual, rhythm of the line, the length and short, the length of the line, it's always there for emphasis. I'm sure there's an exception somewhere. It's always there for emphasis. However, we always want to be very soft and humble when we come to the text and we go, is this, for example, is the linking verb included for emphasis? Or is it included, for example, Mark writes like a fisherman. Promise. He writes like a fisherman. Paul writes like a guy who is trained by the most elite rabbinical mind of the first century. Whoever wrote Hebrews writes like an elite Greek scholar. Probably not Paul. They seem to be a little different. But these are, you can just see like fisherman brain, top-notch, like scholarly brain, even in how they write their stories, which is kind of crazy to think about. Luke's a doctor. Luke writes not like Mark and John write. And so when we read an author, the first place we want to go before we kind of start making certain kinds of conclusions, or we want to say, how does this author write? Does that make sense? What's his style? Because sometimes it may just be kind of that's the way the fisherman puts it out there. He's including those linking verbs because he writes simply. And I love that. Like, I actually love that the style of these folks comes through. Like, God speaks through fishermen and doctors and elite, masters of rhetoric. He speaks through all of them. And so that's all I would say is, if it's included, certain authors, once we really become intimate with Paul, or we really become intimate with Luke, we have huge chunk of Luke's writing, right, with Luke Acts. So we've got a pretty large body of evidence to kind of say, okay, how does Luke write? Oh, and that's what you realize is the more you immerse yourself in that author or authors, you realize he doesn't write like him, and that's weird that he did that. And when you feel like you can hear them, and they're kind of in your ear, what? That is not how he normally structures his sentences. Then that's like really exciting because you realize you're so in tune with your author that you can perceive a stylistic change. And that's even hard in English, right? To really feel like, I know Dickens well enough that I will tell you this is a weird sentence in Dickens. Like, but it's cool. It's really cool. And I wonder sometimes if reading it in Greek isn't sometimes like more helpful than reading it in English for that reason, that you're just kind of forced to really pay attention to things. Whereas like, I can do it in Greek, but I don't think I can do it in English. Like I'm not used to doing it in English because I can just, speed read the English. I can't speed read, but you know what I mean? Like I just can kind of race through even an author I really like. Whereas in Greek, like I'm not that good. It really, I'm forced to slow down. So that's all I would say. I would just kind of have that as a little caveat. So yes, some authors, the way they use pronouns, it's definitely for emphasis. Some authors, again, they're kind of clunky, and they're kind of like how a third grader learns Latin, where they want to, give me the pronoun, give me the verb, No offense to Mark and John, but that's kind of how they write it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, that's exactly right. Yeah. Yeah, because it could actually, and we could have put it in fronted predicate position, kakeha cardia, right? You could totally do that, but they didn't. So it's a really good observation. Sometimes, much to our pain, these observations we have, and we're like, oh, this could be a point of emphasis, and you're like, no, it turns out it's probably nothing exciting. But the fact that you noticed, just the fact that you asked the question, that's so great. A no is not nothing. Right? A no is not nothing. Nothing is nothing, but having to ask the question is great. All right. Good deal? All right, let's go into lesson 9. Kind of a big idea for us. Big because, at least for me, I find we don't think about this way really in English at all. Or if we have ever thought about it, we were probably just told it's a no. All right, so we're going to talk about voice tonight. Voice. So there's this TV show. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so we're talking about verbal voice, not the voice. That's different. Sorry. The jokes just get worse, y'all. They just get worse. And in February, they're even more painful. Okay, so voice. So, for example, when we parse a verb, we say things like, tense, meaning when and how did it happen. You don't have to worry about how yet. But when, for us so far, all of our verbs are in what tense? Present tense, right? Which means they're happening now, right? The when, or pardon me, that's the when. The how, or sometimes called the verbal aspect, would either be like ongoing, like I am running, sometimes called a present progressive, or like a present simple, I run, or simple, I run. Okay? That's just the aspect, or the how. So present could have a dot, so to speak, a simple or a progressive. I run or I am running. English, those are two different things. In Greek, it's not. It's the same thing. All right. Then we have our voice, and so far, every verb except one is in what voice? Present. Active. Okay, so we're going to come back to that. Come back to that definition. Then we go to mood. For us, so far, every voice is what, or pardon me, every verb is what mood? Indicative, which means what? Good. Indicating what? Yes. Good. Oh, but we could be questioning, couldn't we? Like, Angela, or sorry, is your name Angela? Isn't that an indicative question? That would be a type of sentence, but that would be like a declarative versus interrogative versus exclamatory. Yes, you could. How about this? Should we go to the store? That's a different mood. Now again, not maybe in English. We don't think this way. Should we? Ought we to go? Do something with your hands. Like, what's the emotion behind that question? Good! That's the subjunctive mood. I remember when I was learning Spanish growing up, I remember just moaning and like, the subjunctive, oh, but all it is like, it just means, it's subyungo means joined under. So it's like a Jenga tower. And again, this is what we're talking about tonight, but like, it's this like, I don't know, it's dependent upon a dependent upon a dependent upon a dependent kind of situation, right? And you built this like chain of things that by the time you kind of get to it, so I'll build my tower up now. So by the time you get to that, fourth level, so to speak, it's very uncertain. And that's the subjunctive. Anyway, that's what that's about. But for us, still, everything's indicative. Also, we have the imperative mood, right? Command. Then we have person, if it's not an infinitive. We have the person, and we have the number. The root, like dictionary form, right, in translation. Okay. So what we're going to focus on today is the voice. The voice. And so far, we have the active voice. So, what is the active voice, or what is an active voice verb? What does that mean when we say a verb is present, active, indicative? What's doing the action? The noun or the subject? The subject. All right, good. That's how we hedge our bets, right? We're like, the noun or the subject? Good, because it could be a pronoun, right? Or a substantive adjective, like the righteous shall inherit the earth, right? Okay, so simply put, active just means that the subject, that one's a C and that one's an E. Hello. The subject is the actor. That's all that means, is the doer of the sentence. Now, quick aside. We also have the verb a me. I am. There's no actor in that, okay? So that's a whole separate category of verbs, or a separate way to think of it, called stative verbs. They don't talk about what anyone's doing. They just talk about what they're being. So like I exist, or I become, or I am. That's a whole separate category of verbs called stative verbs. These are verbs we usually would call action verbs. Because if you go all the way back in your definition of verbs, a verb expresses it's a word symbol for what? An action or a state of being, right? So that's kind of where these words diverge in the wood. So we could have action verb, or we could have stative verb. So we are now talking about action. And notice I'm not saying active, I'm saying action. Action, Latin, ago, agere, egi, actum. I do. What do you say? Action, or active, they mean doer. So an action verb, from action, oh my word, it's getting worse as I rewrite. Okay, for an action word, it means we have somebody doing something. Somebody. An active verb, who's the one doing? The subject, okay? So, I just like to abbreviate that this way. The subject does the verb. The subject does the verbal action. And again, that could be a pronoun, he swims. That could be a proper noun, right? Bob swims. That could be a common noun, like the man swims. That could be a substantive adjective. The fool swims, whatever, right? All right, so that's active. But in our recitation, there are two other voices that show up. Anybody remember anything else we say? Conjugate luo in the present. Good, that is one of them. The present passive, or the future passive, or the imperfect, etc. Passive. So if active means the subject is the actor, what might passive mean? You have an idea? Good, so we could say it this way, and this kind of comes into normal English, right? The subject is passive. What does it mean if you're like, quit being passive? What are you saying? Okay, do something, right? You're not doing anything. You're just laying there, right? Okay, so that's what we mean is when we say passive, what we're saying is the subject is not active. Or again, we could say is passive. Good, or not the actor. Sorry. That's a good way of saying it. Not the actor. the subject is passive. We could also say it this way. The subject is acted upon. But we have to be a little more precise. Here we go. Let's draw it simply. If for kind of the active, we have the subject doing the verb, what's the passive? Good. The verb is being done to the subject. Right? So we could have, notice, and we could have the same idea. Watch, ready? Brutus stabs Caesar. And we could now, that was active, right? Because Brutus was the stabber. Brutus stabs Caesar. We could flip it, right? Good. And that's exactly what we're going to see. But notice the sententia, the idea has not changed, right? Because the sententia is who's doing the thing? Brutus. And what is Brutus doing? And whom is Brutus stabbing? Or what's happening to Caesar, right? And this. Okay, so the sententia, the actual idea didn't change. I just changed the word symbols that I used. Does that make sense? In English, it's the order usually that we change, right? Brutus stabs versus Caesar is stabbed. I gotta use Greek examples. Sorry. Jesus calls the disciples versus the disciples are called by Jesus. Forgive me, too many years teaching Latin and not enough teaching Greek. Okay. So that's what the passive is. Then we have one more voice in Greek. It's called the middle. Okay. We don't. In Latin grammar and other grammars, we usually call this the reflexive use. Okay? So, if the active, the subject is the actor. In the passive, the subject is passive. That is, the subject does not act and yet receives the action. The middle, it's kind of funny, the subject is all up in the action. The subject acts, or probably we could say, is the actor and acted upon. Active, the subject acts. Passive, the subject does not act but is acted upon. Middle, good, full circle, yes. So the subject does the verb, right, performs the verbal action to himself or herself. Okay? And some verbs are super common with this. For example, I wash myself. And if you know like Spanish or other languages, that's how it comes through, right? Lavome, I wash me, right? Now, that sounds silly to like if you know when you teach people, they're like, of course you wash yourself. Who else are you washing? They're like, exactly. There you go, right? So you can take another object. Good. Or cepillarme los dientes is really funny. I brush myself the teeth, right? I brush myself, so the action comes back upon myself. I feed myself, right? And so in English, we have certain, or in other languages, right? We have certain verbs in certain situations where we're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. We call it a reflexive action, right? It reflects. That literally, scientists, reflect, flecto, flengo, genuflect. Oh, it means to bend the knee. So to reflect is to bounce back. That's all it means. Yeah. So a deflection would bounce away. An inflection would bounce towards you. A reflection would bounce back at you. Derivatives. They're so fun. They're so fun, aren't they? Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, now, one thing that's tricky, so let's take our good old verb luo. All right. Luo. Oh, bad one. Luo. Okay, good. All right. So luo, right, I destroy. Present, middle, passive. And this is going to get us to a kind of a tricky place. Okay? Present, middle, passive. Can you find it? Third page, second page. Good. Luamai. Luamai? Lue, luatai, luamata, luista, luantai. Now, something that's really tricky is for some verb tenses, these forms look the same. That is, the actual, it's like a nominative plural and a vocative plural. They look the same. But it's not, so I just want to clarify this, it is not middle and passive. It's middle or passive. Does that make sense? So the form looks the same. So again, if I conjugated luo in the present middle indicative, it would go luamai, lue, luatai, luamatha, luista, luantai. If I conjugate it in the passive, it would be luamai, lue, luatai, luamatha, luista, luantai. The forms are the same, but it is not both middle and passive. Okay? So they give you a little note in the book, and here's, I'll just say it to you. Assume it's passive. Assume it's passive. Only go to the middle voice, because it's very rare. Only go to the middle voice when you've tried the passive translation and it just doesn't work. Man, I just cannot figure that one out. Okay? So you can think of it this way. It is much more likely if this was going to be something like, I am destroyed by my enemies versus I destroy myself by my enemies. Right? That kind of makes sense? So always assume, or I should say, try first, attempt first, a translation with the passive. Don't go to the middle. Go to the passive. Now, some tenses, they do have a separate passive and middle form. For example, the future. The future has its own passive form. That's at the very end of our little recitation. Okay? But that's that. So that's going to be the main thing that we're going to see when we do these translations. But as we've kind of already seen, there's going to be a new something we need to see. And we saw this, for example, with Jesus calls the disciples in the transition to the disciples are called by Jesus. So we need to figure out this new thing. And for some of you, I know you've had a little bit of Latin grammar and other grammar. Do you know what we call that actor, the doer of the passive verb? It's another word that comes from ago. This would be the point where normally, if it wasn't like 8:30 at night, I sing the James Bond theme, because James Bond is a secret agent. Good. All right. So with this passive construction, what we're going to see many, many, many times, not always, almost always, is an agent, which would be the actor. Notice it comes from that same word, ago, agere, agi, actum. It's that same word. So it's just now the doer is not the subject. That would be Brutus or Jesus, right? Disciples are called by Jesus. So it could be two things, either an agent, which would be the person who acts, or what's called a means, which would be an impersonal thing that acts. For example, I was shot by the gun. Okay, there you go. I was destroyed by my sin. Okay? That's exactly right. That's not a person. Okay? So you have then two options for what we're going to see. The first, with an agent, what we're going to see is a preposition, hupa, plus the genitive. Hupa plus the genitive. That's going to be the first construction we need to kind of learn with this passive thing. Hupa plus the genitive. The second thing, when it's a means, which again just means impersonal, the hammer. I was hit by a hammer. Well, I don't know. I was on a construction site. I don't know who did it. I just know I got hit by a hammer. That's what I know. Okay, that's going to be a dative of means. I can just put this thing into the dative case. So with an agent, we're going to be on the lookout for a person, a personal agent with hupa, so we'll have a prepositional phrase, hupa plus a genitive. If it's a means, if it's an impersonal actor, the hammer, I was hit by a hammer, I'm going to see the thing put into the dative case. So let's briefly think about the dative case. What has the dative been so far for us? Good. Now, for review's sake, what's an indirect object? What do you mean? So like, I kick Billy. Billy's the indirect object? Okay, so this, I would be our subject, right? Kick would be a verb. If we want to get technical, we say a verb transitive, because Billy would be our direct object. Okay, so a transitive verb is just a verb that has a direct object. An intransitive verb doesn't have a direct object. But we could even be more precise. Is this verb active, middle, or passive? Imagine if it was a Greek. Is kick active, middle, or passive? Is that right? You think that's right? Active? It is active. All right. So, what's an indirect object? Okay. I kick the ball. So I didn't change the order. I wanted to not change the order for this example. But that's the same idea you were communicating, right? I took the ball to Billy, I kicked Billy the ball. So I is still a subject? So what's a direct object versus an indirect object? I is still the subject. And in an active sentence, we said the subject's the doer, right? The actor. Is that right? Is that still true? Is that okay here? Okay. So we've still got an active verb, right? And that active verb is transitive. Does it have a direct object? It does. What's the direct object? Okay, and what is a direct object? The direct object, we could say, is, again, if this is helpful, I don't know if it's helpful, is directly acted upon, right? The kick, if you think of, again, physics always comes to my mind here, the force, right, the force directly, I don't know what that sounds like on a microphone, by the way. Anyway, so the force goes directly into the direct object, right? I can feel the heat exchange that's happening right here. Okay, so what's the indirect object? Yes. How does that work with our subject, our verb, or our active verb that's transitive that has a direct object? How does it interact with those things? How does it play with the other parts of the sentence? Okay, good. That could be a clue. It's indirect. Okay. Oh, what do you mean? Tease that out. I think you're really close. That's a little domino experiment here. I don't know if this is going to be successful or not. I'm going to do my best to only act on one of these three things. I'm going to act directly on my phone, which I'm hoping will then apply my verbal action indirectly to the paper towels, which will then have a double indirect object into that. Ah! Well, it did happen, I suppose. It didn't, I didn't get the full domino effect. I should have swapped it with this, right? This will accomplish. This will accomplish. Woohoo! Look at that. So what's indirect object? What's an indirect object? Yes, the indirect object receives the direct object. And if you like to play pool, pool is all about indirect objects, right? Because you only directly ever act on the white ball, the cue ball. right? And then the cue ball goes about hitting the other balls, hopefully. Otherwise, you're not doing a good job at it. Okay. But notice, and I just want to highlight this, these are all, or both these sentences, pardon me, have active verbs. So I want to go back to the question I asked. So far for us, pardon me, the dative has been an indirect object, right? And it could show the true indirect object, or what's called the dative of advantage, which is kind of what you were saying, Alicia, when you said for whom it was done. That's actually not an indirect object. For example, I bought flowers for your birthday. That's not an indirect object. I'm not buying them like at your birthday, right? That's called the dative of advantage. It's for this purpose or for this person. I'm not acting, again, indirectly on that. Grammatical nuance. Okay. So now we've got a new function of the dative. Here's my question, this dative of means thing. Hoopah plus genitive, we're gonna see that a lot as this agent. How will I know if my dative is an indirect object or a dative of means? How will I know? Kind of takes us back to the de question. How will I know? Because now I've got more options. This is the problem in America, right? I've got 78 options for buying ketchup. How will I know which one to buy? Now, you said you have to look at the same. That is correct, but it is too broad. What? How will I know its function? That's the question. Is it an indirect object or is it a means? Now, you said something. You said, is there a direct object? That's a good question. What's a direct object? Is it? Because I just told myself that the subject is receiving the action. Actually, in both a middle and a passive sentence, the subject is receiving the action. So what's a direct object? These things we thought we knew since like third grade or whatever are unraveling in our hands. What is a direct object? This is why I love when you add middle and passive. It like just destabilizes the whole tower. You don't have it? You're so close. Just fight through it. We just have to add precision to our definition. So I'll just say this. Nobody should feel bad about this, okay? I didn't know any of this stuff until I had to teach it. And it was almost always through students going like, well, wait a second, you said, and like, oh, I did say that. Okay. So don't quit on it. We just have to add new. It's the same thing we do with our kids. What's a boy? Well, see, boys are, I don't know, depending on how old the child is, right? That's going to be a different answer. What's a girl? What makes boys and girls different? Again, am I talking to a 16-year-old or am I talking to a 2-year-old? What makes a direct object a direct object? And when we're young, we'll say things like, it receives the action of the verb. But we actually have to nuance that a little bit now. What is a direct object? What's a direct object? Yes. So is the direct object or is the direct object the subject? This is what we have to get our mind around. Okay, good. So can we come up with a definition of a direct object then? Or a definition of a subject? I would accept either definition. But accusative case are just the pants it puts on to do a certain job. Right? Case is the clothes that you wear. And you put on the clothes to accomplish a certain job. So the job... Which sentence? Which one? All right, let's put the sentences up on board. Good. All right. Subjects always go into the nominative case. This is what I have to do when things go up on YouTube. Is like you have to say things like, separate clauses. Okay. So we'll keep it really simple. We'll say Jesus calls disciples. Here, Jesus feeds himself. Oh, I could have done this. And then this one would be, oh yeah, let's use it. Jesus feeds the disciples. Thank you. Thank you. The disciples are fed by I dotted my Y there. Okay. They can. All right. Jesus feeds the disciples. Jesus feeds himself. Now notice, that's a different idea, right? The middle voice is actually a different idea. That's right. He's feeding himself in the middle. So just want to highlight that. Now we can come back to the middle, but I want us to focus, we want to focus our mind on the active and passive example. Jesus feeds the disciples are fed by Jesus. Okay? What is a subject? And again, just to make it super clear, Jesus would be in the nominative case here. Oops. Here. Right. And it would not be in the accusative. It would be watch, I'll use it as an example. I was stabbed by Brutus, or I was stabbed with a sword by Brutus. Okay, but what kind of object, see, because preposition is such a massive category, right? But it's primarily about three things, if you can think about prepositional phrases. For example, I arrived at 1 o'clock. What's that prepositional idea, at 1 o'clock? Good. So prepositional phrases are about time, afternoon, in the morning, whatever, right? It's about time. Or it could be about in my house, at my desk, by the sea. Good place. So it's about temporal, it's about locational. The other massive category, well, most will say, or other adverbial information. If you look at the definitions of, like, prepositional phrases, in like the Oxford English Dictionary, it will say something like, it consists of a preposition and its object, a substantive object, which communicates time, location, maybe you'll see like a degree or extent, or other kinds of adverbial information. So that's what we're falling into right now, is adverbial information. Adverb meaning good, pertaining to the verb. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So when you say they were fed food, what we're really saying is they were fed with food, right? Using food or something like that. That's good. Thank you for accepting that example. Which what? What'd you say? Oh, okay. So what's a subject? All right, I'm going to ask the question differently. How will I know? Okay. Oh, now we're close. Now watch. Here's the really cool thing. So Socrates talks about the teacher being the midwife. Okay? And sometimes that involves a lot more help than others. And that's okay. All right. So now I'm going to ask the same question, but I'm going to add something. Ready? What's the subject of a sentence with an active verb? What's a subject? What's the subject, or yeah, the substantive, right, noun, pronoun. What's the subject of a sentence with a passive verb? Good, the receiver of the verbal action, right? Now watch, ready? What's a direct object? In what kind of sentence? Yes. So direct objects can only show up here. Well, in one sense. You could also have it in the reflexive, right? We could say this way. In an active sentence, or a sentence with an active verb, or a clause, if we want to even be more precise, in a clause with an active verb, which means the subject acts, the direct object is acted upon directly. The verb happens to it. In a middle voice clause, that's also true, right? But it's a little different because what's true of the direct object in the middle voice sentence? It's also the subject. That's exactly right. So it is true that the subject is both our nominative in this case, is both the subject and the direct object because it's reflexive. It's reflecting back to it. So this, in one sense, is our direct object. In another sense, it's just a reiteration of the subject as the direct object. Is there a direct object in a passive sentence? No. Why not? That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So now let's do the same thing with the indirect object, which was the question to start. Isn't this so fun? You just have to back up like 18 spaces to go forward one, right? That's right. Okay, what is an indirect object? Indirect object receives the direct object. Can I have an indirect object in an active sentence? Yes, I can. Yes. Yes. That's exactly right. Can I have an indirect object in a middle sentence? With a middle verb. And by the way, what you just clued in on right there was huge. This is why when we're stuck, we always start with the verb. The verb, notice, is defining the structure of the sentence. What's my nominative going to be? Is my nominative going to be the actor? Is the nominative going to be the subject, the actor and the recipient? Is the nominative going to be the passive recipient only? So can I have an indirect object with a middle sentence? No. I'll just tell you that. So that means here I've got a dative that's going to be an indirect object. Can I have an indirect object in a passive sentence? Your conductor of electricity. What is it? I kicked Billy the ball. Okay, let's think about that. I kicked Billy the ball. Put that passively. Good. So notice we now have two things. We have one agent. Which one just became the agent? By me. I'm now the actor. That would be a hoo-ha plus genitive construction. By me. Hupame. Okay? Hupamu. me. I allotted out the epsilon, which you can do. So by me. But now I also still have Billy, don't I? The ball was kicked to Billy by me. Is that an indirect object? Yes, it is. So I still could have both an indirect object in the dative, as well as I could have this dative of means. I could have both. So I could have a double dative. One could be an indirect object, to Billy. One could be the thing acting. So, for example, the ball was struck by the lightning to Billy. Okay, that's not, but anyway, just imagine that. Because now we have an impersonal actor, the lightning, let's say, and an indirect object. It rolls to Billy by the lightning. Let's use the wind instead. How about the ball was blown to Billy by the wind. There we go. That's better. I was trying to have like a lightning explosion knock the ball. That's okay. So what? What do we take away? What we take away is this. First of all, what's your verb? Is it an active verb? Is it a middle? Or again, remember, default to passive when in doubt, when in question. Luamai, amai, a, atai, amatha, esta, ontai. Okay. Now, because this book hates you, they do something that I loathe so much, and I'm so sorry for. When I teach this, this is where I would stop. So I just apologize for the next 5 minutes. I'm sorry. Sorry about it. From here on out. All right. Go to your vocabulary of lesson 9, page 47. I'm going to try to get the answer key out very quickly on this one. Okay. If this wasn't complicated enough, which it is, I think, for a chapter, but I didn't write this book, and I ain't got time to write another book today. It gets more complicated. Here's how. We have our verb luo. In luo, oh my goodness gracious. Ms. Schwanveld is not going to let me use your classroom anymore. Okay. Haley. Okay. So luo has these forms. Like luo, I destroy, but then it also has, and we're going to just talk about passive for now, luamai, which we would translate passively as you made it a direct object of an active verb. I am destroyed. Good. Okay. All right. Notice what we've done is we have our active ending, o, a, se, amana, ete, usi. We have our middle and passive ending, amai, a, atai, amata, esta, anta. So far, so good-ish. And again, we need practice. That's okay. All right. There are also these verbs that, so this, I'm just going to call this a normal verb. You'll see what this means in just a second. All right, look at your vocabulary. I'm going to go to the second column and just the verb erkoma, one of the most common verbs in the whole language, which this is why they put it in. So I don't want to badmouth the author. When you look at the form erkomai, do you see the ending on it? What is the ending? Good. And your eyes are maybe just barely starting to say, what is that ending? Is that an o, a, se, amen, ete, usi active ending? No. It's an omai, a, atai, amatha, esta, antai, isn't it? It looks like it's a passive, doesn't it? And because this is what it is. It looks passive. So we would expect this to be something like, I am struck, or I am brought, or I am killed, or I am, right? Passiveness. It looks passive, but look at the definition next to it. I come. I go. Is that passive? Nope. Not, I am taken. I go. I come. So this is a category of verbs, and it's massive in Greek, and this is why I put it up here, is because many, 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 many verbs that look passive are going to end up being translated actively. I know. I'm so sorry. Maybe I set you up to be like already downer, so this is my fault. I wasn't positive enough. These are called deponent verbs. This is what this is called. And deponent means literally to put off, like to put aside. And you can think of this way. It looks passive, but it's like putting that aside. I ain't being passive. I'm going to be active because I want to be active. And so what I want to highlight is the vast majority of verbs in this lesson that look passive are actually going to be translated actively because they're deponents. And again, I'm so bummed that he did that, but it's not my book. And if that wasn't enough, he also throws in the verb arco, because he makes me want to be angry, which actively means I rule and takes its object in the genitive, its direct object in the genitive, like I rule the people, arco lau. And when it's in the middle voice, it becomes I begin. Not I am ruled or I rule myself. I know. That's right. And they wouldn't be in their dictionary form. So again, yes. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to do this reveal one more time. And I'll get you the answer key fast. That's my pledge for this chapter. All right, so I'm going to ignore Erikomai for just a second. Look at Luo again. Or again, we could swap out Balo if you want. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. So Balamen, for example, would be we throw. But Balamatha, we are thrown. So what I want to highlight here, again, is this is what a normal verb does. It has these active endings, o, ese, amanete, usi, and it has these passive or middle endings, amai, aetai, amatha, esta, anta. That's all I wish he had put in this lesson, but he didn't. He added in these deponent verbs that don't have active forms at all. And so in their dictionary forms, they're already passive looking. Does that make sense? They do not have active forms. They just don't exist. And that is a category of verbs called deponent. They just never, ever will you see erko. It just doesn't exist. Or exerco, or apocrino, or something like that. They just don't exist. And that's the good news. The good news is they always look passive, and they're always translated actively. They are. And that's why I called these like normal verbs, because they do this normal thing, which this is the vast majority of verbs, have active endings and passive endings, or passive middle endings. These are weird because they only have passive endings, and they have no passive function, no passive translation that you'll see. Okay? Yeah. So some of them, even like, for example, dunamai, which has a little spelling change. It has alphas instead of, like omicron, for example. Dunamai instead of dunamai with an omicron. I can. You can kind of sense like, again, that's not even active really. Like it's more of this like an ability in yourself kind of a thing. So a lot of them will have that kind of like, I become, I begin, I go. Like that doesn't even have a, like you couldn't make that passive if you wanted to, right? And so that's kind of the territory. I'm sure somebody who knows like the true genesis of all these like verbs and, you know, where that was 1,000 years before the New Testament was written, could tell you that there probably were active forms and they faded out of it. That's usually what happens. Is certain forms die off over millennia, kind of thing. All right. This is good fun. But remember, the verb, and you've got so many good new questions to ask. Not just, is it active or passive, but now, is it deponent? Right? Right, or rather, is it active or passive? Oh, it's active. Okay, cool, then I can just solve that. But if it's passive looking, now you have to say, okay, is it a normal passive or is it a deponent passive looking thing, right? So you kind of get another question. You mean like the my sci tie methods that untitled? Yeah. I wouldn't memorize those because that's how I end up. That's how I use the recitation, right? So you will. The only time you'll see, well, the way you'll start to see psi is dunamai does have that as its second person singular. So it could be, it's going to be duna psi. And I think you could look at this, but like dunamai. Oh yeah, at the very end where they say like comments on certain verbs. Dunamai is an irregular. It's an irregular deponent verb. I know, that's right. I will tell you, the funny thing is so my high schoolers just got to lesson 11, and it's kind of the opposite of this chapter. It's like super like low key, like there's almost nothing. You're just getting the imperfect middle passive. So they've already covered middle passive. They've already covered deponent. They've already done all that, and then you get this like super light, easy chapter. Chapter 9 is just kind of the exact opposite. It's like, it's just a mess. And they've already seen all these ideas in Latin, and it's still a challenge. It's just a challenge. But anyway, and they're fresher in their Latin than you are if you took it in high school. And it's still like, oh, right, deponents. Okay. Because Latin and Greek have this thing, but English has nothing like this, of course. That looks passive. All I know about passive growing up is my teacher told me never write in the passive. As if that's a thing. Like, that's a rule that you're never supposed to do that. Anyway, I shouldn't pick on the English teachers too much. Alrighty, I will see y'all. I'll try to get this video and my key up to you quickly.